Welcome back to Let's Make a Game, the channel where we are making a computer role-playing game using the free program Twine and the Sugarcube format for Twine. If you've been following along with the videos in this series, you will recognise this screen. We've set up a fairly straightforward system where, as it says, choose your race. The player clicks on one of these pictures to be a dwarf, an elf, or a human. And then when they make choices in the game, different things can happen based on whether they're a dwarf, an elf, or a human. For example, if they choose to try and wade across the river, if they're a dwarf, the river is sort of too high for them and can pick them up and wash them away, for example. Now, that's a fine system, but you might find it a bit limiting in the sense that every dwarf is the same. If you choose dwarf again and make the same choices, then the same things will happen. Similar for the other two races. And also, it can be a lot of work once you have a lot of encounters. Let's say, for example, you think, well, I want to add a lizard person race because, you know, that's a fairly common fantasy trope. Well, now you've got to go through every different part of your game and work out what would happen to a lizard man in that situation. And so there's a system that might be better in two different ways, and I'll show you what I've done. Let's say I pick elf, for example. Now we find that, and you'll know that this wasn't there if you've been following along. We have a little picture of the race that was chosen, and then we have these statistics down here. These are fairly common abbreviations that are used in tabletop role-playing games, also computer role-playing games. Strength, intelligence, luck, constitution, dexterity, charisma, willpower, and each of them has a numeric value. So this particular character has a very high dexterity and constitution and doesn't have particularly good luck. And if we, instead of playing on, if we restart, if we kept choosing elf and looking at all of their characteristics, we would find that particular ones tended to be high, particular ones tended to be low, and others tended to be average. And similarly, if we kept choosing dwarf, we would find that particular ones tended to be high, low, and average, although they would be different ones. The dwarves would tend to have higher results in different attributes to the ones that the elves had. And if we kept going with humans, we would find that they were a bit more all over the place, that they didn't have a particular attribute that tended to be consistently higher or lower on average, which is often the case in role-playing games. So let me show you what I've done in terms of coding to make that happen. There's a few new things in this video, a few new concepts. And the first one is that I've got this page called Story Caption. And if you went through the other pages in the game, if you went through all of these, you wouldn't find any reference to going to story caption, but it still has an effect because that title, as long as it's laid out exactly like that with the capital S and the capital C and no space in between and so on, that tells the program, run this every time, and whatever gets displayed, put it in the sidebar. And so every time a page opens, the first thing the program will do is it'll look at this code, it'll run the code, and it'll display, if there's anything to be displayed, it will display it in the sidebar. So I'll go back to story caption later. Let's start with my notes. You note that I've noted that there are three variables that weren't here before. AN, which is the number of attributes, in this case 7, AT is the names of the attributes, so that's an array, and then AV is the numeric values, and that is also an array. So when we go to start, if we go past all the stuff to do with the riddle, we will see that set AN to 7, set AT to these values, remembering that I tend not to use slot 0. I find it easier to start from 1, so that's why I've got this null thing here. Actually, I'll zoom in just to make it a bit easier to see. Oh, I went the wrong way. Okay, so I've got the, as I say, I've got the null there, which is for slot 0. Then I've got str, int, lck, con, dex, etc., etc. If you play this sort of games, you probably recognise these as strength, intelligence, luck, constitution, dexterity, charisma, and willpower. I mean, obviously, if you were doing this, you'd probably choose different ones, and you'd probably choose a different number. This is just an example. These are all reasonably common attributes in different games. And then we set AV to be to be an array, but not to put any values into it yet. And when we display the pictures and invite the player to click on one of them, it used to go straight from start to cross or wade. It now goes to generate. Let's load that up again so you can see that. You can see that this this link, for example, now goes to the page generate. So let's look at what's on the page generate. Okay, this is another new concept. This is a, well, what I call them is a for next loop. And this is quite complicated. What it means is go through this list of commands. In this case, we've only got one command, but we could have any number of commands. We could put extra commands in here if we needed to, but in this case, we only need one. So go through this list of commands with a different, with one variable having a different value each time. And here's how we specify that. So there's the first bit is it just tells it it's a for loop. So it tells it the type of command that it is. And then we've got three different mini instructions separated by semicolons. Z equals 1, that is the starting condition. Z++, that's what the computer should do at the end of the list of commands. And Z is under or equal to AN, which, as you remember, is the number of attributes, in this case 7. That's telling it, keep doing this loop as long as this remains the case. So, in other words, it's saying, start at 1, go through this command with Z having a value of 1. At the end of that list of commands, add 1 to Z, and then, if Z is under or equal to 7, go through the list of commands again. So what that means is it will run this command with Z set to 1, then it will run it with Z set to 2, then 3, then 4, then 5, then 6, then 7, and when it adds 1 to 7 to get it to 8, it will look at this, realise, well, actually Z isn't under or equal to 7 anymore, so it will stop. And because the command is set AVZ, i.e. set the look at the array, which is the value of the different attributes, and look in the Z slot, and set that value to be this, random 1 to 6 plus random 1 to 6 plus random 1 to 6. So that is the computer equivalent of getting 3 normal dice, rolling them, and adding them up. I just use that because that's how it's done in the version of Dungeons & Dragons that I'm most familiar with. You could, of course, do anything else, random 1 to 20, random 1 to 100 if you wanted it to be like percentages, but anyway, I just did 1 to 6. So what I've done here is probably the most common use for the for command, and that is sometimes you will have arrays and you want to set up the values in those arrays, and you want to set up each slot separately, but the way that you set them up is the same each time. And that's what I wanted to do in this particular case. I wanted strength to be the sum of 3 dice. I want intelligence to be the sum of 3 dice. I want luck to be the sum of 3 dice, and so on. And so I have set it up to say AVZ, i.e. the AV slot that you happen to be looking at in this sort of run through of the for loop, set it to this random value. And where, you might ask, does race come in? Well, that's the next bit. So what I've done here, I said before that if you kept generating dwarves and restarting the game, you'd notice that particular attributes tended to be higher, and you notice that particular attributes tended to be lower. And the reason for that, and that would be consistent if you played the game for a while, generating dwarves, and then left it for a couple of days and came back, you would find the same attributes being high and low as before. And the reason for that is what I've got here, which is just altering the attributes once they're rolled up. So set AV4 equals AV4 plus 4. That's fairly straightforward. It just means add 4 to the value of that particular slot. That's the same, except it's a different slot. This is a new command. This is called max. Max is short for maximum. And the way it works, if I have something like this, hang on, max zy, that just means the higher of z or y. And there is a sort of equivalent or opposite one, which is min. Min zy just means the lower of z or y. Now, what I'm doing there is I wanted to take 4, because we've added 4 to a couple of attributes. I want to take 4 from a couple of attributes, but I don't want it to go below 1. So what I've got here is set AV3 to the maximum of either 1 or AV3 minus 4. So what that means is take 4 away from this value, but if that takes it to 0 or less, just set it to 1. And then I've done that with basically exactly the same thing except with slot 6. So if you remembered that 4 and 7 tend to go up and 3 and 6 tend to go down, we can look at our list of attributes, which is down here, and 3 and 6 are luck and charisma. So they're the one, luck and charisma tend to go down, and then 4 and 7 is con and will, so constitution and willpower, and they tend to go up. So in other words, I've conceived of the dwarves in this setting as being sort of tough and stubborn, like physically tough and sort of mentally tough as well, but also perhaps a little bit unlucky and not terribly charming. And then I've sort of done similar things. In fact, the code looks almost the same for the elves. It's just that there's different attributes that are being added to and subtracted. In this case, we're adding to 5 and 6 and taking away from 4 and 7. And if we look at our list, we can see that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6 are dexterity and charisma. So these elves are sort of dexterous, perhaps good archers, and they've got high charisma, so they're sort of charming. But then constitution and willpower, where the dwarves sort of excel in those things and have a high average value in those things, they tend to be sort of frail and easily swayed. Now, of course, you may think that's how you want your dwarves and elves to be, or it might be completely different, but that's not the point. The point is, of course, just that this is a way of making a dwarf different to an elf and different to a human, but there's still a lot of individuality between one dwarf and the next because of this randomness. They're not all going to have high constitution, but they will tend to have that. They're not all going to have low charisma. You might roll a very charismatic dwarf, but they're going to tend towards having low charisma. So there'll be sort of tendencies. And finally, let's look back at story caption. As I said, this is the one that displays the sidebar every time. And you notice that the whole thing is and I've just realised I didn't catch the whole thing. It's within an if command. If r, when you've got if r like that, without any like if r is over 5 or anything like that, if you've just got if r, that just means if r has been set so far. If there's been a value assigned to the attribute r, which means because r is the attribute for race or species, that means if the player has chosen their race yet. So what that means is don't try and do this at the start of the game before the player picks their race. So if r, do all this stuff. Well, and what all this stuff is firstly, I've just got div align equals center, which means this paragraph is to be aligned to the center. Set z equals this thing, which includes the value of r, and then print it. And what that will print is something like img, which is image, go into the pics/small, let's say 2.png, and it'll print that picture. And in the relevant place, which is pics, I've got small 1, small 2, and small 3, which are smaller versions of the pictures of the different races. Of small 1 is dwarf, small 2 is elf, small 3 is human. These are the large pictures. They used to be called dwarf, elf, and human. I could have kept them as is, but I changed them to 1, 2, and 3 just to make it consistent with that. So all that's saying is print or display a small picture reminding the player what their character's race is. And then I've got another for loop, I suppose I should call it. So for z equals 1, z is under or equal to an, z++. That's identical to how we did it before. Go through with z equals 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. until z is over an. So in other words, do it for every value from 1 to an, from 1 to 7. And this just means print the name of this particular attribute, so str, int, whatever it may be, then a colon, then the value that was rolled for that. So just tell the player what their strength is, their intelligence is, and so on, and then do a line break. In other words, go down to a different line so that it doesn't print it all as one big paragraph, and instead it's on separate lines. And do all of that, and then there's the closing if. Because that closing if is there, all of that will only happen if r has been set. And that is one way to do attributes. Now, of course, if you do it yourself, you're probably going to want to have different attributes. You may want to have a different way of generating the numbers. But the point of it is, one of the points of it is, that if you want to add a new race, it's quite easy. All you need to do is have a picture, have a smaller version of that picture, so it can display on the side, and then have what adjustments are made to its attributes. And so instead of, whereas if you were using the method that we've been using so far, where you just have a number that is R, when you added a new race, you'd have to go through every encounter in the game and sort of work out what would happen to that particular race sort of by hand, and that might be a bit daunting. I mean, it's not in this particular case. It would be quite easy because we've only got one encounter, but in a sort of proper sized game, it would be extremely time consuming. Whereas this way, you can just add another race, and there's no more work. It just sort of automatically will treat your character in a roughly realistic way, because we'll get into this in future videos, but in these encounters, instead of asking what R is, you'll be asking what the different attributes are. So you'll be asking what the character's strength or willpower or dexterity or whatever it may be is. And the other possible advantage is differences between characters in different plays of the game. You can generate a dwarf, play the game, come back to it, generate another dwarf, and this dwarf is going to have different attributes. There'll be this sort of tendency, the underlying tendency, because of the way that the game adds and subtracts, but they're never going to be exactly the same, and so the right choices might not be the same for you as well, and that can add interest. So I hope that was of some use and interest to some of you, and I hope that you will tune in next time.